Hello and welcome to New Filmmakers Los Angeles in partnership with Movie Maker magazine. I'm Marissa Herrera and I am here with filmmaker David Romberg and his film, The Man of the Monkey. Let's take a look at a clip.
There's a legend that I heard as a kid about a line in this very ocean. That once you cross it, you enter the realm of Villa Grande. That the island has magical powers, and that it chooses who it wants to bring to its shores and who it wants to reject.
David, thank you so much for being here with us today, and congratulations on this incredible film. I really enjoyed it. Can you give us a synopsis for our audience that hasn't had a chance to see it yet?
Sure. Thank you for having me. The Man of the Monkey is about a childhood story that I heard when my family and I were living in Brazil. We lived on a small island that was fairly isolated, living off the grid. And my father told me a story about a strange man that was living in the jungle behind our house. And the story was that he was living with a monkey that was supposed to be his wife, and that he would attack kids if the kids went near him, or people were really afraid of him. And so it was kind of like a bedtime story, a boogeyman kind of story. And years later, I kind of found myself living in other countries, thinking about my childhood, and I decided to go back to the island and kind of investigate the story and figure out why my father had told me the story and what it was about. And I find out that it wasn't just a story, that this man did exist. And from there, it kind of takes a lot of different turns, and I discover a lot of things about the island as well that I didn't know growing up. Things that kind of highlight more violent histories of the island and a darker kind of past. And so that's kind of the basis of the story, but it kind of becomes more also about the island and the people there, and other people who also were seeking refuge on this island, like my family.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And in our previous conversation, you shared that the process of this film took 11 years, and that you ended up with 3 different edits of the film that were, in a sense, different movies. How did you finally decide that this was going to be the final version?
I think it's one of those things that happens, when you're editing something, just like when you're writing a paper or an essay. I think the first time is always just kind of seeing the possibilities of one extreme, perhaps. So, we made a film that was focusing more on the kind of magical realist aspects of living on this island and my childhood. And then it wasn't really working, and so I think it just came out of, partly also we didn't really have an ending until fairly, only a few years before the film was really finished did we have an ending that really made sense. And so we were kind of struggling to also find that story in terms of finding that structure that was going to work. And it was one of those things where I didn't know if I was going to finish the film. And something happened that really I didn't expect, that changed the nature of what the film ended up becoming about. And I don't want to give it away, but it really kind of, it kind of throws you around. There's a kind of like a 360 moment where you're expecting one thing, but really what I end up kind of discovering through this journey is something completely different. And that didn't really happen until very late in the process. And so those first 2 edits were also trying to tell that story without that ending that we have now.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing that. And in the film, that it is a documentary, and that you got to interview, and as an audience member, we got to discover all these amazing people that were native to this island, that had a lot of history there, and they shared their stories. Have they had the opportunity to be able to see the finished film, and what was their response to it?
Yeah, so I was showing, what I ended up doing was going back to the island and showing each of the participants, and I like to call them participants because, I really got to know them, and a lot of them were my friends to begin with. So a lot of the people you see in the film are either people that used to know me as a kid that were like, often would watch me on the beach, when I was running into trouble, or one of the participants taught me how to dive. He was kind of like somebody who looked out for me, taught me how to fish. And a lot of the other participants that I didn't know ended up becoming friends of mine. So I went back to the island, which I do every year now. I kind of I have like a close relationship with a lot of people there now, and I showed each of the participants that I could get a hold of their kind of section in the film. This was before it was really finished, so now I have to go back. My plans are to go back and project it on the beach, kind of like this idea of like what the Lumiere brothers would have been doing in the early part of the century, of like bringing that material back often and setting up these kinds of tents where where people can see themselves. And I think that's so important. So that's kind of one of my dreams, and my next kind of things with the film is to take it back and show the entire film. That I've only shown fragments of it on the island so far, and I think it's going to be really important too, because a lot of the participants in the documentary have passed away. A lot of them were kind of elders and people who had been carrying this oral tradition of storytelling, who knew a lot about the medicines that came from plants, and other kind of more indigenous traditions that have been unfortunately erased and forgotten. So in some ways, it's also like a social memory thing of having these interviews with members of the community that are not around anymore, and having that new generation have access to that and that history of the island, which I think is very present in the film. I think that is going to be another kind of life that the film will have beyond just I would say the audiences that would see it in the United States or even in other countries. I think on the island, it would have a very different meaning. And in some ways, the film is about the struggle for finding home and kind of defining that place. And so, one of the things we talked about before was this idea of, this isn't always going to be there, right? Just because people are living on this island freely doesn't mean that it's always going to be the case, especially with encroaching kind of government control, corporations who want to also profit from the island. So I think it's an important part of that process to bring it back. And I'm really happy you asked that, because it's something I've been dreaming about, and hopefully it will happen soon.
Yeah, I think that's amazing. You talked about this idea of self-discovery and finding home or being home and having it ripped away from you, which this is happening with a lot of these participants. Their livelihoods, land that used to belong to them doesn't anymore, and your own family history of having a home, having to flee it for different reasons, for establishing new places called home. What has this journey of self-discovery been like for you? The filming, the process of the filming over the 11 years. You did include your father and your grandmother's story. So now that you're not in it anymore and you're able to kind of step away from that, what have you learned about yourself?
Growing up, I was very influenced and kind of affected by the stories of my parents, my grandparents, who all had to flee from persecution in different countries and different times for different reasons. And I find myself now in a place where I don't really have to do that, right? Where my generation, with my family at least, is at the point where we kind of do have the ability to decide where we want to go and where we want to live, at least for now. And so I think for people who are children of parents who have experienced those kinds of traumas, there's a different crisis, which isn't a crisis that's directly about danger necessarily, but is really about what to do with that knowledge and what to do with that experience. of what your parents went through and how they transmit those things to you. And so for me, the crisis is kind of about this feeling of disconnection more than it is about, it's disconnection. It's like not really knowing where you belong, because your parents clearly had a kind of had a reason for going to one place or another. And here you find yourself not having that reason, but still feeling the kind of the effects of the trauma that affected your parents or your grandparents. And so, there's something that I asked my father in the film specifically, which is like, what do you do when you don't feel like you belong, and when you don't feel like you have a home, right? And I think, his response was very kind of wise, and now I'm realizing that after all these years, which is like, well, you might never find that, right? You might never really realize exactly where you belong, and that becomes an identity that you share with other people who also are in the same position as you. And that becomes a kind of family or a kind of notion of home, which is, I don't belong anywhere, but there's these other people around me who also feel the same way. And we share that connection, and that becomes, in some way, a non-physical, non-regional, non-even national idea of belonging, which I think more and more is, at least for me, more interesting, right? This idea of like, I might not identify with a country, but identify with human values that I share with other people, or artistic values, or connect to what we're doing, here even, connecting with other filmmakers. To me is part of that process, right? Of finding a community that's not just where you live, but also a larger community. So I think that's kind of what I got from it, was this idea of like, well, I might never find it, and that's okay. And that becomes a kind of journey that you're going to probably continue to take. And I think filmmaking especially is a part of that, right? Is like, films are a way to articulate these things that we can't really express, or things that are hard for us to understand about our own lives. And through the making of a film, I think you often are able to express these things, and they're not resolved, but they're somehow, it's, you're able to talk about them. And that, I think, is some form of growth, right? That's some form of growth that happens there.
No, that's amazing. And, such good insight for new filmmakers that are, going to be watching, this interview and watching this film, to be able to experience that process for themselves. So do you have any best practices or philosophies or advice that you could share with new filmmakers?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, and this is based on this particular film, things that I learned right with this film, which was really a labor of love, but also like there was a lot of blood and sweat that went into it, right? Fundraising was really difficult, and just the fact that it took over 10 years. I had 3 editors also. I mean, I went through so many different stages, and it really, I think, was a traumatic experience in a lot of ways. I think making the film was traumatic, not only because it was about my family and it was a very personal project, but also because it was so difficult to actually make, to actually finish, for financial reasons, for practical reasons, and also for other more emotional kind of reasons. But I think the biggest thing that I would say is, don't, make a film and move on, right? Make a film and just keep moving on and keep making films, because I got in a position where I got stuck, for a long time, and only now am I catching up. I have 5 films ready to kind of go into production or post-production. So I'm way behind. I've been writing this whole time. I've been shooting, but I feel like, to me, growth is so important. And if you kind of try to make one film and make it the perfect film, which also is not something that exists even, but you try to make something that's really good and you get obsessed with that idea, and you can't kind of move on and realize that everything you make is going to be flawed. Everything you make is going to seem flawed a month from the time that you look at it, right? Because you're changing so quickly, especially when you're younger. And so I would say, I wish that I could have had the chance to move on more quickly. I appreciate what I've learned through the process, but now I only want to make short films, right? After having this experience, I really want to make a lot of smaller films where I can kind of still experiment and try things out. It's really hard to experiment with a feature. It's really hard to experiment with a film where the budget's, is larger, and it becomes a kind of, difficult to try new things because there's too many people involved. There's more money involved. So I think my biggest advice would be just like get your projects finished, move on. Even if it's not perfect, just kind of like consider it a part of your past and just kind of like keep moving.
Yes, thank you. So on that, can you share maybe some details of one of those projects that you're getting ready to go into production with?
Yeah, so I have actually have 3 projects that are in post-production. Right now, one is a film about Sir Julio, who is a participant in the Man of the Monkey. He is the person who was incarcerated in this prison that was on the island, and it's a story about his life and how he ended up at this prison that was called the Devil's Cauldron, which was this horrible place where the dictatorship was using this prison to torture political prisoners. It was also a place where a lot of people like Sir Julio, who are orphans, ended up in this prison. And so because of many reasons, but that film is about his life story. And it's a portrait film. So that's one project. The other project is about my father, who was also a participant in the film, and this is about his story. And there's some kind of linkage between the two films, between The Man of the Monkey and this new film that's called The Art of the Olive, which is a reference to a Borges short story, the Argentine writer. And my father was very close, loved Borges, was very influenced by Borges. And so the film is really kind of like a portrait of my father's art career and his life, and focusing on the connection between art, legacy, mortality, creativity, all these kind of things that are connected. And he passed away last year, so that's also very kind of personal film in some ways. I'm not really in it the way that I'm in the Man of the Monkey, but it is a personal film. And then the last film is actually a docu-fiction film, which is something that I've been experimenting with for the last 5 or 6 years, which is a film that also takes place on the island, and is a retelling, a modern kind of retelling of an indigenous story from the island that I heard as a kid, which is a kind of like fairy tale, fantastical story about the daughter of a shaman who ends up kind of having to save the world and has these magical powers. And it was a story that took place during the time that the Portuguese were kind of invading that part of Brazil. And so it's really about this change that was about to happen. And so I'm kind of taking that story and rewriting it in the future. And so it's also a little bit of a sci-fi film. So it's a docu-fiction sci-fi documentary, because all of the actors are participants in the sense that they're playing themselves, right? They're playing who they are in real life. And then it was a collaborative effort. We wrote the script together. So I wrote the script about the future of the island with people from the island and how they imagine what will happen in the future, right?
That's incredible. Wow.
Yeah, and it was a beautiful experience. You can see examples of it on my website. We ended up doing a social memory project, which was through this film, we actually interviewed a lot of the elders in the community as well, and we did a whole series of portraits of stories that we have a Facebook for that as well, a Facebook site where people who have passed, who have now passed on, their children and the grandchildren are now posting on Facebook and being able to relate to their grandparents and kind of share stories about this community. And so even though it was a fiction film, it had script, it had, a crew and everything, a lot of it was really based on the oral histories and the kind of the social memory of this place that I love, that if there was a place that I would call home, it would be this place, this island, even though I'm an outsider in some ways as well. I was educated in the West, in the United States. And so that's another film that is now in post-production, and a very different kind of film, but I'm very excited about that.
Yes, we are so excited and looking forward to seeing all of these. Thank you so much for joining us today. Congratulations on your film. And we look forward to seeing all of these projects come to life and hopefully back here on our screen so that we can share again soon. So thank you.
Marissa. Yeah.
And to our audience, thank you for joining us today on behalf of New Filmmakers Los Angeles and Movie Maker Magazine. We'll see you again soon. Thank you.